The tires of the old sedan vibrated against the cracked asphalt, a steady, rhythmic thumping that had travelled with Samuel Vance for the last 100 miles. It was the only rhythm left to him, a mechanical heartbeat cutting through the chaotic roar that lived inside his skull. He kept his forehead pressed hard against the cold passenger-side glass, watching the dark trees blur into a solid wall of shadow. The world outside was slipping away, melting into a featureless black expanse that offered no comfort, no answers, and no escape. Every crack in the road sent a jolt straight up his spine, but he welcomed the pain. It was a physical anchor against the drifting, terrifying formlessness of his own thoughts. For 3 years, his mind had been a war zone. The noise was constant, a terrible, formless screeching that never faded, never paused, and never let him rest. It had begun on the interstate, in the exact fraction of a second when his car had veered off the slick road and smashed into the concrete barrier. Ever since that day, peace was a concept he could no longer remember. His life had dissolved into a frantic search for silence, an obsessive quest that had ultimately led him to the isolated valley where St. Jude's stood waiting. When the car finally slowed down and came to a full stop, Samuel did not move. He looked up at the structure looming over the gravel driveway. St. Jude's Hospital did not look like a place where people went to heal. Built from massive blocks of dark, water-stained grey stone, its high towers and narrow windows gave it the appearance of an ancient castle or a forgotten fortress. The iron gates behind them shut with a heavy, final clang that echoed across the empty grounds, a sound that felt less like a security measure and more like the snapping shut of a trap. The heavy wooden front doors opened, and the air of the lobby swallowed him whole. It was warm inside, thick with the suffocating scent of old library paper, floor wax, and harsh cleaning chemicals. A tall nurse with a pale face and an expressionless gaze met him at the entrance, her white shoes squeaking sharply against the polished tiles. She did not speak as she led him down a series of high-ceilinged corridors and into the private office of Dr. Elizabeth Thorne. Dr. Thorne, the head doctor of St. Jude's, was an imposing woman who sat behind an immense wooden desk. The surface of the dark oak was buried under neat stacks of medical folders and historical charts. Samuel's eyes wandered around the room. High, narrow windows let in a dim, muted light, casting long shadows across rows of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with thick medical volumes. There were no personal decorations, no photographs of family, no colorful paintings, no soft touches to ease a patient's mind. Everything was cold, functional, and intensely serious. "Please sit down, Samuel," Dr. Thorne said. Her voice was remarkably smooth, perfectly leveled and calm. It was a calculated voice, the specific tone an expert might use to soothe a panicked, dangerous animal. "We received your full medical file from the state clinic. You have been carrying a tremendous amount of pain, Samuel. Your anxiety levels are dangerously high, and your sleep records show complete exhaustion. Here at St. Jude's, we specialize in isolation and routine. We can help you find the quiet you need." Samuel sank into a hard leather chair across from her, his muscles tense. He could not bring himself to look her in the eyes, keeping his gaze fixed on the intricate grain of the floorboards. "I don't care about anything else, Doctor," he whispered, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "I just want the noise in my head to stop. Every minute of every day, I feel like my own mind is standing right next to me, screaming at the top of its lungs." Dr. Thorne leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "We will begin you on a regimen of specialized medication designed to slow your thoughts down, to turn that screaming into a whisper," she explained calmly. "Our daily schedule is simple but absolute. You will wake up at exactly 7 o'clock each morning. Group therapy begins at 9 o'clock in the central room. In the afternoons, you are permitted to walk or sit quietly in the outdoor courtyard. The building is divided clearly. The west wing contains the bedrooms where you will sleep, and the east wing holds our medical offices and therapy rooms." She paused, the silence in the room suddenly becoming heavy. Reaching down, she picked up a heavy gold fountain pen and began to tap it slowly against the edge of a desk. Tap, tap, tap. The sharp, metallic sound sliced through the room, causing Samuel to flinch violently, his shoulders jerking upward. Dr. Thorne watched his reaction closely before continuing. "However, Samuel, there is one very important, unbreakable rule you must follow while you are here. On the second floor of the West Wing, at the very end of the main hallway, there is a door marked Room 214. It is strictly forbidden to go near that room. No patient is allowed to touch that door, hang around the corridor, or attempt to look inside." Samuel forced his head up, his tired eyes meeting her serious gaze. "Why is it locked?" "It is currently undergoing extensive structural renovation," Dr. Thorne replied instantly, her voice smooth and devoid of hesitation. "The ancient wooden beams beneath the flooring are rotten and highly unsafe. Furthermore, we discovered a highly toxic strain of mold growing deep inside the plaster walls. To protect the health and safety of everyone in this facility, we have sealed the door permanently with a heavy iron padlock. As long as you respect our boundaries and stay away from Room 214, your time here will be perfectly safe and fine. Do you understand this rule, Samuel?" "Yes," Samuel murmured, dropping his chin back toward his chest. "I understand." He truly did not care about a locked room at the end of a hallway. He was too exhausted, too broken, and too hollowed out by his own thoughts to care about anything other than the promise of a dark, silent room where he could finally close his eyes. A burly orderly named Marcus carried Samuel's single, lightweight canvas bag up the wide stone staircase. Marcus was a mountain of a man with thick forearms and a broad, kind face, but he walked with a slow, heavy, and deliberate step that seemed to carry the weight of the building itself. The hallways of St. Jude's were uniform and unyielding. They were painted a flat, clinical white color that offered no comfort to the eye. Underfoot, the floors were lined with a thick, dense gray carpet. It was a strange fabric, specifically designed to completely swallow the sound of footsteps, leaving the long corridors in an artificial, unnerving state of quiet. As they walked deeper into the heart of the second floor, Samuel felt the silence pressing against his eardrums. It felt as though the very plaster of the walls was absorbing the light, the heat, and the life out of the air. They walked past a dozen identical doors, each with a small black number painted neatly onto the wood. Finally, Marcus came to a stop in front of room 205. He turned a key in the lock and pushed the door open. "This is your space, Samuel," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his size. "It's simple, but it has everything you need. A bed, a desk, and a small window that looks out over the northern woods. The shared bathroom is just a few doors down the hall." Samuel stepped over the threshold. The room was small, stark, and perfectly clean. The iron frame of the bed held crisp, tightly tucked white sheets and a heavy, dark blue wool blanket. High up near the ceiling, built directly into the thick plaster, was a small square air vent covered by a heavy metal grid. A soft, continuous, and low humming sound vibrated from the vent, blowing a steady stream of lukewarm air into the confined space. Samuel walked over to the narrow window to look outside, but before he reached it, his curiosity pulled his gaze back toward the hallway. Standing in the doorway, he turned his head to look down the opposite side of the long corridor, toward the very end of the west wing. At the end of the line, the flat white paint abruptly stopped. There, set deep into the stone archway, was an old door made of rough, heavily weathered dark oak wood. It looked completely out of place, like a fragment of a medieval dungeon left behind by the modern world. A massive, rusty iron padlock hung from a thick metal latch screwed directly into the heavy timber frame. The shadows at that end of the hall were deeper, and the unpainted door looked cold, heavy, and dead. "Don't look down that way too much," Marcus said gently. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, warm hand on Samuel's trembling shoulder. "Like Dr. Thorne said during your intake, it's just an old, forgotten room with rotten floorboards. This building has been standing for over a century, and things are always breaking or rotting behind the walls. Just keep your feet on this side of the floor, focus on your recovery, and you'll be perfectly safe." Samuel nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered on the dark oak for another second. Marcus smiled kindly, stepped out into the corridor, and pulled the door shut behind him, leaving it just an inch ajar. Samuel sat down heavily on the edge of the firm mattress. He watched through the small window as the natural light began to drain from the sky, the silhouettes of the distant pine trees fading into blackness. The low, mechanical hum of the ventilation vent was the only sound left to fill the room. For the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, the chaotic screaming inside his head seemed to soften, matching the rhythm of the vent. His eyelids grew incredibly heavy. He lay back onto the hard pillow, pulled the blue blanket to his chin, and drifted into a deep, heavy, and dreamless sleep. The next morning, the bright glare of the overhead lights woke Samuel at exactly 7 o'clock. Following the strict instructions left on his desk, he washed his face and made his way down the wide stone stairs to the large recreation room for breakfast. The room was vast and cold, filled with long rows of grey plastic tables and a mismatched collection of heavy vinyl chairs. Massive, unadorned windows lined the outer wall, letting in a pale, weak morning light that did little to warm the space. Around 15 other patients were already present in the room. The atmosphere was heavy. Some moved with a strange, slow-motion legalism, eating their food in complete silence, while others sat frozen, staring out through the glass at the bleak landscape beyond. Samuel moved through the breakfast line, taking a light plastic tray loaded with a simple bowl of unsweetened oatmeal and a steaming mug of black coffee. Looking for isolation, he chose a small, isolated table tucked away in the far corner of the room. He had no desire to speak, to share, or to interact with anyone, yet he found it impossible to look away from the people around him. He watched them intently, trying to see how the suffocating quiet of St. Jude's had affected their minds. 2 tables away, an elderly woman caught his attention. Her name tag read Evelyn. She was dressed in a remarkably beautiful, elegant blue dress that looked like it belonged at a formal dinner rather than an asylum. But her behavior was deeply unsettling. She was using her bare, pale hands to iron her dress flat against the hard plastic surface of the table. Over and over again, with rhythmic, desperate movements, she dragged her palms firmly across the fabric, attempting to smooth out invisible wrinkles that simply did not exist. Her face was entirely drained of color, and her wide, unblinking eyes were filled with a profound, motionless terror. Before Samuel could process the sight, a shadow fell over his tray. A young man, roughly 25 years old, sat down directly across from him without asking. His name was Julian. Though he was young, his face looked deeply aged, worn down by heavy, dark purple circles that sunk in his eyes deep into his skull. His dark hair was a messy, tangled mat, and his fingernails were bitten down so brutally that the skin around his cuticles was raw and bleeding. Julian could not sit still. His body shifted constantly, his head jerking every few seconds to check the reflection in the massive windows behind them. "You're the new one, aren't you?" Julian asked. His voice was incredibly low, a rapid-fire whisper that moved with a frantic speed. He spoke with an intense urgency, as if he were running out of air, or running out of time. "Yes," Samuel said carefully, taking a small, warm sip of his coffee. "I got here last night." "My name is Julian," the young man said, his hand flying to his forearm to scratch at the skin with a frantic rhythm. "Listen to me. Don't sit near the glass if you can avoid it. The reflection out there. It distorts things. It makes it impossible to see exactly who is standing right behind you in the dark. Samuel stared at him, unsure of how to respond to such a raw display of paranoia. I will remember that. Thank you. The pills they give you here, the small yellow ones, they make your brain thick, Julian continued, leaning across the table until Samuel could smell the stale adrenaline on his breath. They want us heavy. They want us to stay under the blankets, keep our mouths shut, and make no noise. But sometimes sleeping is the most dangerous part of the day. The night changes things in this building, Samuel. The architecture shifts. You'll see. You'll see soon enough. Before Samuel could press him for an explanation, the heavy tread of a nurse cut across the floor. A sharp hand tapped Julian on the shoulder, informing him that it was time for his morning vitals check. Julian stood up instantly, his eyes darting one last time to the dark glass of the window before he disappeared into the crowd. By the fourth day of his residence at St. Jude's, Samuel felt less like a living man and more like a wandering spirit. The routine was an iron cage. Twice a day, once in the morning after breakfast and once before bed, a stern nurse named Clara would hand him a tiny paper cup containing 2 small yellow pills. The effect of the drug was immediate and total. It made his brain feel thick, heavy, and slow, as if his entire conscious mind had been wrapped in layers of wet, freezing wool. The sharp, agonizing ringing that had lived in his left ear since the car crash didn't disappear, but it altered its shape, turning into a low, muddy, and wet hiss. He spent the vast majority of his hours sitting in the dusty hospital library, staring blankly at the yellowed pages of decades-old magazines, his eyes moving over paragraphs without registering a single word. But on the 4th night, the chemical wall cracked. Samuel woke up instantly, his mind snapping into total clarity with terrifying speed. There had been no nightmare, no sudden crash of thunder, no visible disturbance. His eyes simply flew open, staring up into the shadows. He turned his head to look at the small digital clock sitting on his bedside table. Its plastic face glowed with sharp, blood-red numbers, 3:14 a.m. The atmosphere within room 205 had changed completely. The air felt thick, heavy, and highly pressurized, charged with the identical static tension that hangs over an open field seconds before a massive lightning bolt strikes the earth. He swung his legs out from under the heavy blue blanket, his bare feet touching the carpet. His skin was freezing, yet it was drenched in a thick, oily sweat. Moving like a shadow, he crept to the bedroom door and looked out through the thin 1-inch gap into the hallway. The main west wing corridor was completely dark. The bright daytime overhead lights had been shut off, leaving the long hall illuminated only by the faint, eerie green glow of the emergency exit signs at either end of the passage. And then, breaking through the silence, he heard it. It was an incredibly faint, high-friction sound. It sounded exactly like 2 pieces of rough, bone-dry sandpaper being rubbed together in a rhythmic pattern. Samuel stepped out of his room, his bare soles sinking into the grey carpet. He stood perfectly still, freezing his breath inside his lungs, listening with every nerve in his body. The sound was emanating from the far left end of the hallway. It wasn't mechanical. It was a human voice, a dry, desperate whisper cutting through the darkness. Samuel felt a violent wave of cold goosebumps erupt across his skin, but an intense, unnatural curiosity overrode his fear. He began to step forward, creeping down the corridor. He passed the closed, silent door of room 207. He slipped past room 209. He glided past room 211. With every single step he took, the sandpaper quality of the whisper grew sharper, louder, and more distinct. It was no longer a voice speaking with a formless noise. It was a voice speaking with a terrifyingly clear, rapid, and rhythmic cadence. He crossed the invisible boundary line where Marcus had told him to stop. He didn't care about the rotting floorboards. He didn't care about the toxic mold. He kept moving until he stood directly in front of the unpainted ancient oak door of room 214. The massive iron padlock hung from its latch, completely motionless in the green dark. Samuel leaned his body forward, tilting his head until his right ear was separated from the dark, cold wood by less than an inch. The air that bled out from the thin, splintered cracks around the frame of room 214 was freezing cold, striking Samuel's face like a winter draught. It carried a heavy, distinct odor, the sharp, metallic smell of old copper coins mixed with the damp, rotting scent of freshly dug earth. Samuel held his breath, pressing his cheek closer to the timber. The voice inside the room was tiny, dry, and hollow, yet it spoke with an absolute, terrifying weight of certainty. It sounded precisely like a person standing dead center in a vast, empty room, speaking directly into a thick wool blanket. The brakes did not fail on their own, Samuel. You knew the fluid was leaking 3 full weeks before the crash. You stood in the driveway, you looked right at the small plastic tank under the hood, and you closed the metal cover anyway. You wanted the choice to be taken completely out of your hands because you were too tired, too weak to live your life. Samuel reeled backward as if he had been struck in the chest. The air left his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp of agony. His shoulders slammed hard into the white plaster wall of the corridor, creating a loud, dull thud that seemed to echo forever down the hall. His heart was hammering so violently against his ribs that he could feel the pulse throbbing in the back of his throat. In a panic, he slammed both of his shaking hands over his mouth, biting his own knuckles to keep from screaming out loud. How could something inside that room know that? It was a secret he had buried in the absolute deepest, darkest corner of his soul. He had never spoken it aloud. Not to the state police officers who wrote up the official accident report, not to the trauma doctors who patched his skin together in the emergency room, and certainly not to Dr. Thorne during his intake interview. It was a hidden, shameful, and monstrous truth that he only allowed himself to think about when he was completely alone, trapped in the dark. Who is in there? Samuel whispered into the green shadow. His voice was a thin, trembling wire, barely audible. The rusty iron padlock did not shake. There was no sound of footsteps, no shifting of weight, and no movement from behind the heavy oak paneling. The dry whisper inside simply grew softer, dropping in volume syllable by syllable, until it faded away into a long, cold, and quiet sigh. Then, the West Wing corridor returned to total silence, broken only by the deep, distant, and mechanical throb of the hospital's subterranean heating pipes. Samuel turned and fled. He ran blindly down the carpeted hall, burst into room 205, and threw himself onto the mattress. He hauled the heavy blue wool blanket completely over his head, curling into a tight ball. He lay there in the dark, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the fabric until the first pale rays of the morning sun began to turn the window grey. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, Samuel took his place in the circle of blue plastic chairs arranged in the center of the therapy room. Dr. Thorne sat at the head of the formation, a thick leather notebook resting neatly on her lap, a gold fountain pen held between her fingers. The other patients were slouched deeply in their seats, their expressions blank and heavy, their minds thoroughly slowed by the morning dose of yellow pills. Samuel's eyes chewed through the space, darting from face to face around the circle. A sudden, cold paranoia had taken hold of him. Was this entire hospital a set-up? Were the doctors playing an elaborate psychological game with him? Had they installed hidden microphones in his bedroom walls, or searched through his old personal journals while he slept? Samuel! Dr. Thorne's smooth voice broke through his thoughts. She was looking at him over the rim of her small, square reading glasses. You look remarkably pale today, and the circles under your eyes suggest you had trouble sleeping last night. Would you care to share what happened? Samuel gripped the textured edges of his plastic seat, his fingers squeezing until his knuckles turned completely white. I woke up in the dead of night, Doctor, he said, keeping his voice as level as possible. I thought I heard someone speaking in the hallway, a voice near the end of the wing. Dr. Thorne didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a warm, professional, and thoroughly practiced smile. This is an incredibly old structure, Samuel. The walls are built from thick, uninsulated plaster, and our heating infrastructure relies on old sheet metal pipes. When the temperature drops in the early morning hours, those metal lines rapidly expand and contract. It creates a very specific, sibilant hissing sound, one that can easily sound like a human whisper to an anxious mind. It is a very common auditory illusion, especially when a patient is dealing with high levels of sleep deprivation. Samuel looked across the circle. Julian was sitting there, his eyes bright, manic, and completely clear of the drug's influence. Julian was nodding his head up and down with an incredibly slow, deliberate rhythm, staring directly at Samuel. Beside him, Evelyn was totally disconnected, her hands moving frantically across the skirt of her blue dress, smoothing out the invisible lines over and over. Yes, Samuel lied, dropping his gaze back down to the floorboards. You must be right, Doctor. It was just the old pipes. I'm sorry for bringing it up. There is absolutely no need to apologize, Dr. Thorne said smoothly, her pen scratching a neat line into her notebook. Adjusting to a new environment takes time. Trust the routine, Samuel, and allow the medication to do its work. But as her voice filled the room, Samuel knew with absolute certainty that she was lying. Expansion pipes could hiss, and metal could groan. But sheet metal could not speak his name. Old copper pipes did not know the layout of his old sedan, nor did they know about the cracked plastic fluid reservoir he had deliberately ignored under the rusty hood. The moment the therapy session was dismissed, the patients drifted back into the large recreation room. Samuel walked directly to the metal coffee machine in the corner, his hands trembling so violently that the black liquid sloshed over the rim of his paper cup. Suddenly, he felt a light, sharp touch on his elbow. He spun around on his heel, nearly dropping the cup, and found Julian standing inches from him. Julian looked horrific. His skin had taken on a dull, leaden-grey color, and his teeth were visibly chattering. "You went down there," Julian said, his voice an incredibly sharp, low hiss. His eyes darted frantically toward the open doorway, where Marcus was standing with his arms crossed. "I was watching through the crack in my door at 3 in the morning. I saw you walk all the way to room 214. You stood there, Samuel. You listened." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced around the room to ensure no other nurses were within earshot. "I heard something, Julian. But it's a trick. It has to be. The staff must have mounted a small speaker behind the door frame. They are monitoring us, testing our psychological breaking points. It's not a speaker, you idiot." Julian snarled softly, his entire upper body shaking with a mixture of intense rage and terror. A speaker plays a recorded tape. A tape can only repeat what some technician recorded onto it. A tape doesn't know what you did when you were a helpless child. It doesn't know about the lit match I dropped into the straw of my cousin's barn. It doesn't know the name of the little boy I left standing there when the black smoke started to fill the air. Julian's chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and ragged. "The room knows everything," a soft, brittle voice murmured from behind them. Samuel flinched as Evelyn appeared silently from the shadow of a large plastic ficus plant. Her pale hands were still moving across her wool sweater, ironing out the phantom creases. "The nurses tell us it's just the wind passing through the old stone masonry. But the wind doesn't know my mother's maiden name." The wind doesn't spend every night reminding me of the little white pills I purposely forgot to leave on her tray the exact week her legs stopped working. Samuel looked from Julian's manic face to Evelyn's hollow, ancient eyes. A massive, icy weight dropped deep into his stomach. The nightmare wasn't unique to his own broken mind. The locked room at the end of the hall was a shared engine of torment that sat in the dark center of the ward. Every single patient sleeping on the second floor was being systematically dismantled by the exact same unpainted oak door. "Why don't we just walk out?" Samuel whispered, panic finally breaking through his voice. "If we all know what that room is doing to us, why don't we just pack our bags, go down the stairs, and force our way through the front gates?" Evelyn looked up at him, a tiny, deeply tragic smile touching her lips. "Because we can't leave, Samuel," she whispered softly. "Out there, in the real world, our secrets stay locked inside our own skulls. They burn us from the inside out, eating away at our lives until we want to die. In here, at least the walls are doing the talking for us." From that afternoon forward, Samuel stopped sleeping entirely. Every night when Nurse Clara came around with a medication tray, he would place the 2 yellow pills under his tongue, wait for her to turn her back to initial his chart, and then slide them out, spitting them into a small tear in his pillowcase. As the heavy sedatives cleared out of his bloodstream, the fog lifted. His mind became hyper-focused, sharp, and intensely alert. He rejected Evelyn's passive acceptance. He refused to believe in ghosts, demons, or magic. If a voice was speaking in the dark, there had to be a physical mechanism, a tangible pathway that carried the sound from one point to another. He began to meticulously examine every square inch of room 205. The walls were solid plaster, cold and impenetrable. The only break in the architectural surface was the small square air vent located near the ceiling. The vent was secured by a thick, heavy iron grid that had been screwed directly into the structural frame with long security screws. It hummed without pause, blowing its lukewarm air into his face. On Tuesday afternoon, a golden opportunity arrived. The entire ward was scheduled for mandatory outdoor exercise in the courtyard. Samuel stayed behind in his room, telling the floor nurse that he was experiencing a blinding migraine and could not tolerate the direct sunlight. The nurse, overwhelmed by a massive stack of state insurance paperwork, barely looked up and waved her hand to grant him permission. The moment the heavy double doors of the west wing clicked shut and locked, Samuel sprang into action. He gripped his heavy wooden nightstand and dragged it slowly across the grey carpet, careful to make no sound, until it was positioned directly underneath the ceiling vent. He stepped onto the shaking piece of furniture, his balance unstable. Pressing his nose and cheek flat against the freezing iron grid, he peered deep into the darkness of the duct. What he saw was incredible. The air duct wasn't a standard, modern ventilation pipe. It was an immense, horizontal shaft made of thick, uninsulated galvanized sheet metal, nearly 3 feet wide, running straight down the entire length of the residential corridor. It was an architectural artifact from the building's original design as an early 20th century tuberculosis sanatorium, where maximum airflow was a medical necessity. As he held his breath and pressed his ear against the bare iron, he heard it. The metal pipe wasn't just moving air. It was functioning as a flawless acoustic conduit. A vast, chaotic, and multi-layered tapestry of human sound was drifting through the hollow metal network. He could clearly hear Dr. Thorne's voice 2 floors below, discussing a medication dosage with her secretary. He could hear the distinct metallic clink of soup spoons being washed in the basement kitchen, and, most terrifyingly, he could hear a low, rhythmic, and wet breathing sound coming from the far left of the line, the exact direction of room 214. The truth clicked into place. St. Jude's was not a collection of private, isolated bedrooms. The entire facility was a single, massive, and interconnected acoustic instrument. The hospital possessed a hollow metal skeleton that gathered every single breath, every painful groan, and every whispered confession spoken within its walls, carrying them through the dark to a central point. By the conclusion of his second week, the psychological pressure within the West Wing had become completely unendurable. The whispers bleeding out from the cracks of room 214 were no longer solitary, isolated voices. The room had begun to stitch the secrets together, weaving them into a terrifying, continuous chorus. When Samuel stood in the dim green light outside the oak door at 2 o'clock in the morning, the old wood felt hot, physically vibrating against the palms of his hands. The voice inside was a shifting, monstrous composite of everyone on the floor. Evelyn took the gold rings from her sister's drawer before the funeral service had even ended. Julian left his small terrier inside the locked car during that 3-hour afternoon in July. Samuel wanted the steering wheel to slip. He wanted the sedan to hit the concrete wall because he couldn't bear the thought of waking up and going to work on Monday morning. "Stop it!" Samuel screamed, completely losing control. He raised his fists and slammed them violently against the rough oak paneling. The heavy brass padlock rattled wildly against its iron latch, its sharp, metallic ringing echoing down the empty, green-lit corridor like an alarm bell. "Open this door! Let us out of this place!" A powerful hand suddenly clamped onto his shoulder from behind, squeezing down with enough brute force to bruise the muscle. Samuel spun around instantly, his heart stopping, expecting to see Marcus or Dr. Thorne holding a long silver needle loaded with liquid sedatives. Instead, he was staring into the hollow face of Julian. Julian's skin was completely white, his eyes bloodshot and wild. In his right hand, he was gripping a heavy, pointed iron fire poker that he had ripped from the hearth down in the main recreation room. "We have to see what's inside," Julian hissed through his clenched teeth, his entire frame vibrating so hard his jaw clicked. "We have to destroy whatever is living in the dark down here. It won't let me close my eyes anymore, Samuel. It knows about the river. It knows exactly what I did when the water started to rise over the floorboards." "Julian, put that down," Samuel whispered frantically, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "The night nurse. She'll hear the metal. The nurse is dead to the world at her desk. They don't care about us anyway. They want us to hear it." Julian snarled. With a sudden, explosive surge of manic strength, he drove the sharp, pointed tip of the iron fire poker deep into the narrow gap between the rusty iron latch and the ancient wooden frame. The old oak would splintered with a horrifying, high-pitched screech that sounded exactly like a human bone snapping under a heavy boot. Samuel didn't try to pull him back. A desperate, overwhelming hunger for the physical truth obliterated his terror. He reached out, wrapping both of his hands around the heavy brass padlock, using his entire body weight to pry the iron loop away from the cracking wood. With one final, violent snap, the old iron screws tore completely free from the timber, showering the grey carpet with dry brown splinters. The heavy oak door swung open, drifting slowly inward into a deep, absolute, and pitch-black darkness. Samuel and Julian stepped across the threshold, their muscles locked, preparing for a physical horror to leap out from the dark. Julian held the heavy iron fire poker high over his shoulder like a club. Samuel reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic lighter he had stolen from a bin in the outdoor smoking area. He flicked the small metal wheel, and a tiny, flickering yellow flame illuminated the space. The room was completely, totally empty. There were no electronic speaker systems mounted in the corners. There were no hidden tape recorders, no microphones, and no wires attached to the walls. There were no ancient spirits or monsters waiting in the shadows to feed on their guilt. There wasn't a single piece of furniture, no bed, no desk, no chair. The room was completely bare. The floor was rough, unsealed concrete, stripped entirely down to its grey subbase and covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust that had remained undisturbed for over 30 years. The elaborate story of structural renovations and dangerous mold that Dr. Thorne had fed him was a complete fabrication. The room had simply been gutted, left as a dead, hollow void sitting directly at the geometric center of the west residential wing. Yet, the whispers inside this empty concrete square were louder than they had ever been out in the corridor. They were absolutely deafening. The air was thick, vibrating with a roaring storm of human voices, murmuring, crying, and sighing from every corner of the ceiling. Samuel walked slowly into the very center of the room, his bare soles leaving deep, crisp tracks in the grey dust. He lifted the small lighter higher, casting its light upward. In the exact center of the ceiling, at the precise junction where the massive concrete support columns met, was the main nexus of St. Jude's entire ventilation system. A massive, circular metal intake horn, nearly 4 feet wide, dropped down through the plaster like the mouth of an immense brass instrument. It was bolted directly into every major horizontal air line on the floor. As he stood directly beneath the giant metal opening, the acoustic illusion of the hospital collapsed into reality. The circular horn was an architectural accident. Because of the specific curved shape of the building and the rigid, uninsulated metal ducts, this single empty room functioned as a natural, mechanical megaphone for the entire residential block. And then, as Samuel focused on the voices pouring out of the metal mouth, he finally understood the true source of the horror. The voices roaring out of the giant metal intake pipe were not born from an evil presence living inside room 214. They were coming from the bedrooms down the hallway, carried through the open vents in real time. But these were not the voices of conscious people awake and plotting. Through the metal megaphone, Samuel clearly heard Julian's voice, thick, slurred, and heavy with sedatives, drifting from the vent of room 205. He heard old Evelyn's voice from room 208, sobbing and whimpering in the middle of a horrific nightmare. He even heard his own voice, bouncing back from the cold iron pipes from an hour prior, muttering frantically into his pillow while his conscious mind was trapped in sleep. The true horror of St. Jude's Hospital was not a monster in the dark. The horror was that every single night, the moment the heavy yellow pills took hold and the patient's conscious mind shut down, their sleeping brains began to purge. They were talking out loud in their sleep, confessing their deepest, most destructive shames to the empty air of their bedrooms. Because of the giant metal horn hidden inside room 214, every one of those sleeping confessions was pulled from the bedroom vents, funneled into the main line, mixed together inside the metal pipes, amplified by the concrete walls, and thrown back down the corridor like a chorus of ghosts. The room didn't know their secrets. The patients were telling each other everything without ever knowing it. They were listening to their own unfiltered vulnerabilities, echoing through the hollow bones of the asylum. Samuel looked over at Julian. The young man was staring up at the metal mouth, his jaw hanging open in shock. The heavy iron fire poker slipped from his loose fingers, hitting the bare concrete floor with a loud, ringing clang. Above them, the whispers continued to pour forth, a beautiful, terrifying, and seamless symphony of human guilt, completely naked of shame or sanity. The doctors hadn't built a trap. The hospital had simply built a giant mirror out of galvanized metal and old stone. They had kept the door locked with a heavy padlock so that no patient would ever break it open and realize how simple, and how completely terrifying, the reflection truly was. The true monster wasn't waiting inside the quiet room. It was what they whispered to themselves the second the lights went out. The following morning, there was no confrontation, no anger, and no punishment from the hospital staff. Marcus arrived shortly after breakfast with a leather tool bag, quietly screwing a brand-new iron latch into the splintered wood of room 214. A new brass padlock was snapped into place, shiny, clean, and gold. Dr. Thorne did not bring up the incident during the group circle. She merely looked across the room at Samuel and Julian, a quiet, knowing, and heavy look in her eyes. Their medication cards were unchanged, and the daily routine remained absolute. Samuel sat silently by the narrow window of room 205 as the sun began its long descent behind the pine trees. He looked up at the small square air vent near the ceiling, listening to the soft, continuous hum of the air passing through the metal network. He knew that in a few hours the night nurse would walk down the quiet carpeted corridor with the tiny plastic cups. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would take the yellow pills this time. He would swallow them down, because the only alternative was to stay awake, night after night, and listen to the raw, uncovered agony of the entire floor. He finally realized that St. Jude's was never designed to be a place for a cure. It was a place for containment. The world outside could not survive if the masks of daily life were ripped away, exposing the raw guilt that lived inside every human skull. People needed their secrets to stay silent. But here, in the West Wing, the machinery of the building stripped the masks away every night. As the darkness finally swallowed his room, Samuel lay back onto the firm mattress. He didn't fight the drugs. As his eyes closed and his mind began to dissolve into the heavy, chemical blackness, he heard the first soft, sibilant hiss from the air vent above his head. It was Julian's voice, starting to tell the story of the river once more. Samuel opened his mouth to answer, his sleeping thoughts reaching up to join the choir, adding his own shame to the giant metal lung that would breathe their sins into the hallway until the end of time.